Good Yontif. I'd like to start this sermon by giving you some insight into the rabbinical High Holy Day sermon writing process. There's always this fear that if we write this sermon too far in advance, something could happen in the world that would make our sermon outdated, insensitive, irrelevant. And this year, with a global pandemic, with an unusually active hurricane season, the need for High Holy Day sermon flexibility was greater than ever. So it's a very welcome surprise that I don't have to spend a sermon talking about how much worse the pandemic has gotten. Thankfully, we seem to be trending in the right direction. And instead of talking about New Orleans being hit by a hurricane, God forbid, I can direct our attention to the efforts our congregation is taking to provide relief to those who have been affected in our neighboring states. Check the website for that information or contact Rabbi Lexi. This Rosh Hashanah, I have the opportunity to speak about something truly miraculous and wonderful, something that I absolutely did not see coming. And before I reveal what that is, I want to take us back to the 6th century in Jericho. Back in the 6th century, which was several hundred years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the synagogue became the center of Jewish life in Israel. Jews in Jericho constructed their synagogue in a very similar manner as we do today, with symbols on the walls identifying what's important to them, just as we do in our sanctuary today. Now, all that remains of that 6th century synagogue in Jericho is the mosaic floor. And the floor contains all the images you might expect: the Ark of the Covenant, a lulav, the menorah, and a shofar. And among those illustrations on the floor is an inscription. You can see it right now on your screen. For a long time, I have viewed this synagogue as one of the countless pieces of evidence of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and how it dates all the way back to biblical times. But today, the inscription carries with it the greatest significance. More on that in just a moment. Now on your screen, you are seeing something that I thought I would never see. What you are looking at is no less than miraculous. These images, which are projected on the ancient walls of the old city of Jerusalem, are the flags of Israel, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. They are celebrating the Abraham Accord, a peace agreement between Israel and two Arab nations. This is a miraculous bright spot in an otherwise difficult 2020. And just to give you some context as to why this is so important, on May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel declared its independence as the British mandate expired. The United Nations developed a partition plan to divide the land based on where people currently lived. The Jewish land will be part of a Jewish state, and the Arab land will be part of an Arab state. No one would be displaced. The Jews accepted the United Nations partition plan to live in peace among her neighbors, but no Arab or Muslim majority country would accept it. On May 15th, the very next day, members of the Arab League, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Transjordan, the Holy War Army, and the Arab Liberation Army marched their forces into the land, telling the United Nations that they would not tolerate a Jewish state. To everyone's surprise, the infant state of Israel defended its territory and won the War of Independence. In 1967, Egyptian dictator Gamal Abdel Nasser announced his plans, in his own words, to destroy Israel. He placed his troops at Israel's border, and quickly the state was surrounded by Arab enemies once again. Israel preemptively struck Egypt and Syria and won even more land in a shocking victory. Shortly thereafter, the Arab nations went to Sudan and proclaimed what was known as the 3 no's. No recognition of the state of Israel, no peace with the state of Israel, and no negotiations with the state of Israel. In 1978, despite the 3 no's, Israel actually negotiated peace with Egypt, which was now under new leadership, giving back the land that they won in the War of 1967. This was the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country. In 1994, Israel signed a peace treaty with Jordan, settling land and water disputes and agreeing to cooperate regarding water, tourism, and security. And that's it. There are 22 Arab states in the Arab League, and in 72 years of its existence, only 2 of them have recognized the state of Israel and made peace with it. The other 20 states refer to Israel as the enemy. Their refusal to make peace or even acknowledge Israel's right to exist pose a very real and constant existential threat to the Jewish state. Additionally, the Palestinian Authority relies on cooperation from the Arab League as part of their pressure campaign against Israel. And while it took 72 years for 2 countries to make peace with Israel, this week alone, 2 Arab countries have signed peace agreements, and it looks like there are more to come. There's a practical reason why this is so miraculous, as well as a symbolic one. Israel spends over $16 billion on defense, one of the highest percentages of their gross domestic product in the world. We all know that Israel is an innovative country. Despite having to use so much of their budget on defense and security, they still finance startups and encourage entrepreneurship. Most of the times we use technology or appreciate scientific or medical advancement, we can thank Israel in some way for its contribution. Imagine what Israel could do if it were not burdened with 20 countries dedicated to its destruction. And symbolically, this peace agreement is potentially even more significant. The Arab League has typically condemned every attempt to normalize relations with Israel for the sake of the Palestinian cause. This was expected in their last meeting last week. But after a 3-hour meeting, the Arab League did not condemn the normalization deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It was truly stunning. With this vote of confidence, the Arab League began to remove the taboo associated with making peace with Israel. On a side note, and I believe this will be a good topic for another sermon, I think that normalization with the Arab League will force the Palestinians to choose leadership that will look out for the best interest of their people and faithfully negotiate peace with Israel. The great Golda Meir of blessed memory once said that peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us. It appears, God willing, that day has come. Nations in the Middle East are seeing how economically, technologically, and militarily beneficial a peace relationship with Israel can be. If this continues, it will indeed usher in a new era of peace in the Middle East. Let's go back to Jericho again. The mosaic floor with the inscription. I said earlier that this inscription carries a new significance today. The inscription reads, Shalom al Yisrael, peace upon Israel. Not only have Jews existed in the land since Israel was in biblical times, they have always been pursuers of peace. They have never started a war. They have never sought to grow an empire and dominate the region. They are a small Jewish state with great ambition and desire for peace. Even throughout the young history of modern Israel, we have always been willing to make peace with our neighbors. In 1948, we asked for peace. In 1967, even as the Egyptians and Syrians fought us, we begged Jordan not to attack. In 1967, we gave land for peace, and in 2005, we tried to do the same. Shalom al Yisrael. This was the hope of our ancestors in the 6th century. This was the prophecy of King David 3,000 years ago. This is the goal of the Israeli Defense Force. Oseh shalom bimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the source of peace grant peace to us, to all who choose to make peace with Israel, and to all people of Israel wherever they may be. And let us say, Amen.